Alix, thank you so much for joining me again. I'm super excited to dig back into everything I can learn from you. Um, so thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. And by the way, I'm very grateful. I was surprised, how well our first video went, but I'm very impressed with your audience. The people that have been reaching out have a certain caliber to them. So I think what you're doing is really amazing because you've attracted an audience that is really, really smart. Um, I think the stuff that we put out was good, but the feedback that I've gotten has actually been even better than the stuff that we put out. Um,
Yeah,
and one of the things that surprises me of that, by the way, is that some of my investment heroes that I don't know reached out to me
really.
after having watched your interview. So I think your audience has a reach that is actually excellent.
Awesome. No, I'm glad to hear that. I think it's one of the most rewarding parts of doing this, right? Of putting anything out that you get this resonance and you get in touch with people and you have this shared language, right? They get back to you on ideas that you put out and it
Right.
creates a very quick way of connecting and having an interesting conversation. So I'm glad that happened for you too.
Right.
I know you're still a little bit new to the Twitter game, but it's an incredible, I guess, community. So I'm glad to see you be, um, yeah,
It really is. I would pay a lot of money to use Twitter on a monthly basis, and guess what? We actually get it for free.
free.
By the way, what's amazing also is one of the most common piece of feedback that we get from the video that you and I did was, I can't believe this content was free.
Mm,
And I think it shows the value of adding value and just putting out stuff that's really going to be helpful to younger and in many cases older analysts and PMs too.
yeah, and I always love what you said. Like you want to have younger, you want to have mentors. That mentors can be both older and wiser, but also younger and more energetic or curious or sort of more in touch with things. Which brings me actually to the topic where I want to start, which is this. We touched on it, or you touched on it last time, but this whole area of networking and
Mm,
connecting with people, building a network, and it it feels important to me. Is one of the most popular pieces that I've done was on Buffett and this idea that yes, he reads a lot, but people take it to this extreme and they come up with this misconception that oh, all it takes is reading and ingesting information,
right.
and I think your personal experience as well as what you studied, you spent a lot of time on networks and how to go about that. So maybe frame that a little bit and um, explain to me a little bit like okay, how do you think about networks? We touched on it briefly last time, but because you talked about, for example, offensive and defensive qualities. Like there's a lot of stuff where I think you go very deep, and I'm just like, okay, let's frame for me how you think about that whole area and
Sure.
what you
But
focus
first,
on.
I want to say thank you to, I forgot to mention that I want to thank the people that gave us uh, shout outs on their Twitter for our interview. Because again, the talk about networking, my friends are my wealth. Um, and, I'm always moved when I think about, how my friends have helped me. And if you're the average of the five people you spend the most time with, I'm one of the most fortunate men in the world. So some of the guys that shared our interview, guys like Herb Greenberg, Michael Mobison, Dan McMurtry, Tom Morgan, Josh Wolf, Eric Markowitz, Chris Abdelsemi, I'm sorry, Chris Abdelmessi, Michael Billings, and Anthony Cambero. Anthony, for example, is very early on was a person that really helped shaped who I became as an investor. A lot of the learnings that we did together very early on were really incredible and shaped me all the way to today. So say thank you to those guys. And again, you guys are my wealth. So networks. the way to think about a network is at the same time a moat, and it's also a margin of safety, to use uh, value principles.
Mhm.
And how is it a moat? Well, if you think about threats and opportunities, a network throws opportunities at you. So it's a moat, it's a competitive advantage that enables you to accomplish your investment goals. How is it a margin of safety? Well, it warns you of threats. You could be, driving down the road, there's a cliff over there, you may not see it, but somebody from the side is like, hey, did you see there's a cliff down there? And you take a look, it's like, oh, there's a cliff, so I have to slow down. So, networks also give you private information and access to resources. And it gives you the ability to influence others or the course of events even. And it also lowers your costs of doing your process, and it also extends your reach, right? And it takes work. Proper networking is a long game, and you may not see the benefits of it for a long while you're building it. But again, I think there's a slide in the presentation that we did where it shows a distributed network, a centralized network, and a
Mhm.
decentralized network. And you have to go out and build what I think is a decentralized network. And the way you do that is the things that I mentioned, network components, these triads, hubs, connectors, filter aggregators, and masterminds that you can create, and really having the philosophy that once you create them, let them go, and eventually something comes back to you, and doing that. And I think some of the things that we should discuss, like if we're going to discuss networking, have to do with three things. One is the importance of triad creation.
Mhm.
Triad creation, by the way, I use a sociological term. It really means putting people together, right?
Connecting.
Being the
Yeah.
middleman, right? The second thing is, if you're going to deal with networking, especially for younger analysts and older, is John Whitehead, the CEO of Goldman. He had a great saying. He says, important people like to deal with other important people. Are you one? And this concept of how do you raise your importance when you're younger? And also, how do you approach an important person?
Mhm.
That's really important. And then the third thing is, how do you use networking tactics and strategies for field research to do what you do? And it's also important to understand that, again, analytical work is not just reading things and analyzing. One of the things, that reason I love your piece on Buffett is you showed how Buffett went out there and built a network. There's a perception that this guy stays in a room, and reads 10Ks all day long. And I think that's a flawed perception. Not only because in the early days that's not what he did, but today he's built the attractor that people call him,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
And that you have the inbound phone call. So we can talk about these things when it comes to networking, because I think that if you're going to cover networking, you have to cover these three things.
Yeah. Let's tackle them one by one. And I mean, I learned the triad concept from you, and I implemented, and I guess maybe outline how that works, and then maybe also touch on it. But as you said, it takes work to build these networks, and
It
so
does.
at least for me, some of this is not intuitive. If I read a networking book, I'm usually okay. Somebody who's very extroverted and loves to go out and talk to people wrote this, and they're like, constantly be among people and do this. I'm like, it for me, it's an active process. I have to remind myself, oh, it would be a good idea to
Right.
do this. So how do I
Right.
maybe explain the concept, and then how do you make it intuitive for people where it's not what they naturally do?
Sure. By the way, the best networkers I know are actually introverts. They're not actually like me. I'm an extrovert, so being with people is my happy place.
Right.
Being in the corner meditating No, that's actually uncomfortable for me. By the way, I always laugh when these introverts tell me, "Oh my God, meditating is so amazing." I'm like, dude, that's your fucking happy place.
Exactly.
You
That's
know,
great.
so
That's great.
so so you gotta be, it's like meditating. Yeah, an extrovert meditating and doing it is actually way more valuable than an introvert doing it.
Yeah.
What a triad is, very simple, is you take two people in your network that don't know each other, but that have something in common, right? Where they're trying to accomplish something, either a goal or a task, or they might really get along. And what you do is you introduce them together. You write an email and you say, John, meet Michael. I thought you guys would want to meet because of X, Y, and Z. Look forward to hearing how it goes and having them connect. And then, more importantly, letting them be, right? Sociologists that have done studies of networks find that the most successful people have 6 stable triads in their networks. And again, if you're looking for the work to back this up, there's a bunch, but I refer you first to David Logan's book, Tribal Leadership, chapter 10 on triads, where he discusses it. And here's what stops people from creating triads, okay? We all have post-traumatic stress from one thing. When we were younger, we introduced one friend to another, and they took off and left us behind and had all this fun
With all
without
this
us,
fun. Yes.
right? So now we started hogging our networks. No, 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 I don't want to introduce this person.
Mm.
That's a scarcity mindset. You need to have an abundance mindset. Uh, we also have a fear of getting ripped off, of someone taking advantage of us. Um, and you kind of have to get over that. You have to get used to the fact that people are going to be successful without you. And uh, actually, in Judaism, I'm not Jewish, but I've studied a lot of religions, and I love this concept of mitzvahs, right? Which is a blessing, usually done when you introduce a man and a woman to each other. Talk about a triad, and it's a blessing because of what it adds to the community. And I think a lot about introducing people to each other, about business mitzvahs, right? So, triads are how you get network effects in your life,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's also how you start social processes from happening. By the way, most powerful business partnership in the world is probably Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett. And we tend to focus on these two guys, but we never ask, wait a second, who introduced Charlie to Warren,
I think it
right?
was one of Buffett's investors, right? And he set up this dinner when Munger was in town
That's
for
right.
all this.
That's right. And he
Sorry to
said,
jump in, but I was like, oh, yeah, I remember.
you
That's
remind me of Charlie Munger. And Warren was like, who's that? Can you imagine had that partnership not been put together?
yes. I thought
Um,
about that. Yeah.
Triads are also a leadership tool. One of the best military generals I've ever met. Um, when he's trying to solve something, one of the things that he'll do is he'll take one division leader and say, okay, let me introduce you to a second guy. And then he tells them, this is the objective I want you guys to accomplish. And then you guys manage each other to accomplish that objective. And then weeks later, sometimes he's even forgotten that he did that. They come back to him with a solution,
Yeah.
right? So it lowers your costs of management,
It's a little bit
right?
like planting seeds, right? You're introducing these people, you're planting the seed, and then you kind of walk away, and sometimes something will come back, and you may not even be aware of that process anymore, and they may go on. In some cases, people will remember, right? They'll, oh, Alix introduced us, so
That's right.
it'll.
That's right. I was once introduced to a CEO by a third person. This was over 12 years ago. And the CEO and I ended up investing in his company. I went on his board. 5 years after, we were looking for another board member. And who did we think about? Well, the person that introduced us,
Yeah.
right? And 5 years later, this guy gets a call, and I say, hey, we want a board member. And he said, well, I don't really have time to get on board. I was like, well, I haven't told you about the comp package yet that you're going to get. And he said, I do have the time. And had he not created that triad, he would never had access to that opportunity.
Right.
Right.
So I'm thinking about, I like it. I'm obviously trying to implement it as well. But you mentioned the second point was sort of this question of importance, right? And sort of if your network isn't that big yet, and I sometimes struggle with that. I was like, oh, I like this person that I just met. I would love to have more people to introduce them to, but you sort of run into this wall of like, well, there's no flywheel yet. Like if the network
Right.
is a little bit skinny,
Right.
how do you get this going, and how do you get your way to people that are, quote unquote, worth introducing to, right? How do you cold start this?
Look, there's a few ways. But first, you gotta go back to this concept of important people like to deal with other important people. And as a younger person, how do you raise your importance? Right. And first, you have to think about that the young guy, he's got all these barriers in his mind as to why an important person doesn't want to talk to him. So you kind of have to get over these barriers first. One of the barriers is I have nothing to offer this important person. Right. A second barrier is who am I to contact this person? I've done nothing yet in my life, blah, blah, blah. Right. Get over that. Okay. You have to think much more highly of yourself. But also remember, there is nothing that an important, wealthy, well-connected person that is usually unhappy wants more than a good student that wants his guidance. That is going to do what he says to do. And that's going to give him feedback when it works and when it doesn't. A lot of older people, and by the way, I really recommend you read the book of Arthur Brooks on this, From Strength to Strength, Life After Your 50s. And he recommends teaching and mentoring, as that gives people that are highly successful a lot of joy and motivation. And it's this thing about being a good mentor, but when you get that old, having mentors that are younger.
Yeah.
Because they give you energy and they remind you how to be young again. And they remind you of the naive question, which you've forgotten how to ask. Right? So how do you raise your importance? First, you have to be on the same mission as the guys that you accomplish, that you're trying to build relationships with. And if they're into business and you're not into business, you're probably going to have a hard time unless you're into art and they're into art or something like that, right? If you're into learning, you're approaching a non-learner, you're not going to be in the same mission. I personally, I'm into self-development, exercise, nutrition, and recovery, because I know what a competitive advantage that is. And when I usually meet somebody that's way ahead of me and we have that in common, it's an instant relationship.
Right.
So the primary way that I would do it for a younger person, you have to leverage the institutions that they belong to. So for example, the alumni list of your school. Are you able to contact these people and build relationships with them? Right? The country clubs, the philanthropies, the charities. Some people join these things just for the networking aspects, to be able to network with important people. Right? One way of doing it as well that I think works very well is writing great content and using content as leverage. One way that I've done it, and I know plenty of other people that have done it as well, is they read a book. they immediately contact the writer after that, right? And build relationships with the writer. And I suggest you use Professor Rao's technique when you contact a writer saying, this is what I admire about the book I just read. This is what I can do for you, and this is what you can do for me, and always make what you can do for them be bigger than what they can do for you, right? So if you're a younger person, one of the things that you can do for them is saying, hey, I'm gonna organize a Zoom with all my friends for you to come in and talk about what you're working on today. If you're a student, you say to them, hey, come to my school. I'm gonna have an auditorium filled with people just to listen to what you say. You know, the writers, they love attention just like we all do. They're not gonna say no to that. But now writers are actually very important contacts, right? Think about the influence and the power that a writer can have. So once you have these writers in your network, when you first meet somebody, that's going to be one of the first people you introduce them. If there's a fit, if there's a triad, right? Teaching and having access to talent, right? That's some of the younger people that I know that are saying, hey, I'm going to learn this topic, teach it to others. And now when they meet somebody that's looking for talent, they have access to that talent. That's one way of raising your importance.
Interesting.
Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, no, I like that one. I didn't really think, and I know you do teaching. It is, I didn't think about the idea of doing that. Yes, gives you access to, I guess, a pool of talent that you can then connect and share. So it's a well of possible triads.
You bet. You bet. And teaching, by the way, is I don't like things that are altruistic. I don't like things that are self-serving. I like things that are both altruistic and self-serving. And teaching is both. I love seeing young people do well with what I've taught them. But I also love 5 years later when they call me with their best ideas, right? So,
Yeah.
so that's amazing. And that's, again, you planted the seed in them, and then it's 5 years later that it becomes an oak. So how do you approach an important person? Okay, one thing you have to understand is that if an important person is really good, they're going to be busy, right? So the most important tactic is going to be persistence. You're going to have to email him, call him many, many times to be able to get in front of him. And also, very important people usually got to where they got because of persistence. So it's the only thing they truly respect in somebody else is somebody else that's also done that. And by the way, one of the patterns of success is constant persistence in the face of constant rejection until you breach through that barrier to entry, right? So persistence is key. And I always say to some of my young friends, when do you stop actually contacting the guy? And they never really know what the answer is. And I say, hey, it's when they put a restraining order on you. Okay. It's like when they say, hey, stop actually calling me, and legally you're not allowed to be within 1,000 yards of them, that's when you stop. But until then, you keep continuing until the person has expressly said, hey, do not contact me again, keep calling. Okay. Of course, it's better if you have a social connection through a school, through a connector, through a social venue. If you have a common affinity, you know, I know a friend of mine that became highly connected because of kite surfing in the tech and venture world. He was a kite surfer. The other guys were kite surfers, and most of the deals and investments that he gave came from that, right? So you write the person approach, you get in front of them, you get given this time period. You need to come prepared that you've actually researched this person's life and that you have questions. So literally bring a notepad and questions. But you also want to focus on a certain type of question. You need to figure out how to get him to speak about his fears and frustrations, the problems he's trying to solve for, and his wants and aspirations. What's he working on that he's trying to accomplish 3 to 5 years from now? And you keep asking questions across the categories of what he's trying to accomplish. Once you have that, you're probably not going to have a solution because you don't have the experience or the contacts. Use that as a project. Go and try to solve for those fears and frustrations and wants and aspirations. While still keeping things confidential, call your other mentors. Say, hey, hypothetical, somebody's trying to accomplish this. And you got to keep things discreet, by the way, but use hypotheticals. How would you go about doing that? Write those things down, put it in a document, send it back to the guy. That's another way of raising your importance. This important person that you meet, you have another important person in your network. Introduce them. Important people like to deal with other important people. Take them out to lunch. If you have the money, pay for lunch. Don't let them pay for lunch. Right? That's one way of making sure that now you're in the mix and you've raised your level of importance. And then the cold approaches. The number of time in New York City that I see somebody that I want to meet walk down, you have to be ready to make a cold approach. One of my favorite writers, I cold approached him like that, and now we have a very strong relationship. I get his books. I help him edit his books now, which is incredible to actually watch him work on something. It's fascinating. You know, so those are the ways that you approach an important person, while still making sure that you do things that raise your importance as well.
Yeah, I've watched you do that on the street. I was like, oh shit, that's ballsy, but that's great. That's very courageous. No, I like that. I was like,
look, you need courage.
Yeah, yeah.
You need courage. You know, these things, these tactics apply as much to your personal life as they do to your business life.
Yeah.
You know, when I was younger, for example, and single in the city, you know, just to be a good guy, I would take girls that I would meet and I would introduce them to each other. And then I started noticing that I was getting set up more on dates by those girls with other girls that they knew, which is a direct result of the triads that I was creating. Right? So it was a happy accident. And my friends were like, where are you getting all this deal flow from? Right? And you know, and again, it's just a tactic. And my cousin, who's single, you know, she was having a hard time meeting people, and she started just hosting and bringing people together. And that's as a result of that she met her husband. You know, so these tactics help personally as much as they do in your business life.
Got it. I love it. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the institutions and you mentioned country clubs. So I'm just reading the Isaacson biography of Leonardo da Vinci, and so he touches on certain places become hubs, right? Like it was Florence during the Renaissance. There's all kinds of examples, but usually there's a few places where a lot of interesting people in a certain domain mix and mingle. And then I'm like contrasting that with, for example, Buffett removed himself from New York, right? And there were different reasons like low overhead or having support of friends and family. So I'm curious how you think about the importance of being or having access to, I don't want to say the right place, but certain places, certain hubs. How do you think about the importance of place, and has the digital realm kind of replaced that, or how does that work?
It's extremely important. You know, if you want to be in the hedge fund business, for example, being in New York, London is going to be very important. You know, because the people you run into, it's going to be vital. You can, and also, I love the digital. I love Twitter, but a lot can be lost in the digital interactions, right? So And by the way, once you have real world relationships, so we have a lot of relationships with people that are anonymous on Twitter. I know who they are in real life, but on Twitter they're anonymous. And when they publish something, it's a real advantage to actually understand
Mm.
who that person actually is, right? It can illuminate context very rapidly. So it matters a lot. If you don't have that, I think Twitter is an amazing substitute, and also the internet. But even with the big guy, Buffett, he didn't just stay in Omaha. He was constantly traveling.
Right.
The guy was visiting companies on his honeymoon, for God's sakes.
Yes, it's a great one. It's like constantly,
I
always,
love
always
that
working,
guy.
always on, always curious. It's
Uh,
so true.
he left his wife in the car. So, yes, it's important to be in the right places. And if you can't travel, uh, have the internet as a substitute. But the second that you can, but by the way, even in your hometown, you will have access to people that are in business, and using these networking tactics on these people, it's actually very valuable. The people like to talk about, you know, uh, uh, be a medium-sized fish in a big pond, but it's great to be a big fish in a small pond too,
Mm.
and develop a sort of home court advantage that you can have in certain cities, which, by the way, it's actually very valuable because, I grew up in Paris, but as soon as I had this sort of like a New York or Miami network, when these people traveled to Paris, I had a home court advantage in Paris, right?
Right.
And I could show them the town, introduce them to people, and so on. So, start with where you are and what you have for sure.
Got it. Where do you think people go wrong? Meaning, are there certain ideas or practices that are there traps to fall into? Like the idea of like, oh, running around a conference and giving everybody your business card. Like, what do you see where people try to build a strong network, but they're either doing it not efficiently or just not effectively, and they're kind of getting in their own way?
One, not creating triads, constantly doing this one-on-one
Mm.
networking, which, by the way, very valuable, especially if you fall for the right mentors. But not taking people and fusing them, it's kind of like that saying, the best time to have planted a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today,
Yeah.
right? You need time to let these triads take the network effects. Um, the second that I would say, and this is very important for research, I have to mention this as a sort of a disclaimer. When you use these networking tactics as an analyst or PM, you're much more prone to falling for MNPI, right? You're much more prone to actually getting material non-public information.
Yeah.
So you have to be extremely careful, right? And the second that you think you got something that's hot, you got to call the lawyer or go to compliance, and also make sure that you mention to your compliance people and not your PM, so that you don't compromise your PM,
Mm.
right? You don't restrict him. Very important. And that you document everything, because, like, for example, it happens sometimes that we're locked in on stuff because I'll be on the phone with somebody and like, shit, did I just get an NPI?
Mm.
And you just have to make sure. It's very, very important, and that's actually a flaw of the approach, but that can be mitigated if you are careful. The second one, and this is going to be for the younger people, is this problem of upgrading your mentors, right?
Yeah.
I can't recall if I
I
spoke about.
think you touched on it last time in the
Right.
sense that you go from, I guess, one mentor to the next important one, and you don't keep in touch with, so you can't really fall back on the person where you haven't maintained the relationship.
That, and that person feels hurt,
Yeah.
because you usually have these hustler types that are people after my own heart, by the way. But they meet this person. It helps them get the person helps them get to the next level. And then once they realize that they need another person, they kind of drop this person off, and it becomes a sort of a ghosting slash, you know, totally forget this guy and move on to the next level. And you see successful people after successful people that have done that, but what you don't see are the guys that did not succeed.
Yeah.
And when they fell back to the previous level, that person wasn't there to hold on to them, and they crashed down. Right? So grow from your core and with your network, bring your mentors along with you. You know, stay in touch with them. And by the way, one very important networking practice that is not only makes you a great human being, but it's a very important practice is gratitude phone calls. You know, where you make a list of people that you haven't spoken to for a while and say, hey, you call them up. Hey, I love you. I miss you. You added a lot of value to my life. I know we haven't spoken, but I'm here for you if you need me. Hang up.
That's a great one.
It's very important gratitude expression. It makes you a good human being, and it's also very self-serving. So again, I like things that are both altruistic and self-serving at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just re-underlining that and also putting a little asterisk. Like I should do that. Now,
so before I forget, the you know, I love the philosopher Gibran, Khalil Gibran, who my mother introduced me to. He's got this great quote in his book. Says, you know, a man went to a Sufi master and said, teach me how to be successful. And the Sufi said, I'll teach you more than that. I shall teach you how to be generous to the unsuccessful. That will pave the way towards your own success and give you far more. I shall also teach you how to be generous towards the successful. Otherwise, you will be liable to become bitter and unable to work towards success. It's a very important quote.
Interesting. I like that one. I'll have to write it out in the piece. One thing that was stuck in my mind is because I've just been reading a bunch of Graham Duncan stuff, and I know you two are a fan of different models for thinking about people's personality types. And once you understand some of that, you realize some people are going to be a more natural match for each other, right? And you have this idea of, I don't know what you call it, the power pair or the power pairs. So I'm curious how you think about that, I guess, in investing as well as in your network. Is that, does that influence how you connect people, and also what you look for in, I guess, when you look at a company, a management team, investors, how does that all influence each other?
Very much, very much. I was trained in personality typing by probably the best in the world in my mind. It's a woman, her name is Antonia Dodge. Very much changed my life. And part of the reason why we've been good at the personality typing stuff is we understand the flaw of personality typing. All models are wrong, some are useful. If you understand the flaws of the model, you can actually apply it better. And my friend Maria, she calls personality typing, astrology for nerds. Which is she wasn't being complimentary. But having said that, if you understand the flaw, and the main flaw, by the way, is that every personality typing system is partial. So there's 4 personality typing systems that cover 4 categories. Cognitive, how you think; affective, how you feel; kinetic, how you move; and developmental, how you develop. So if somebody says, well, Myers-Briggs is flawed. No, Myers-Briggs only covers cognitive, right? A test like Caliper only covers cognitive and maybe a little bit of the others. So what you need is a test that covers all four aspects of your personality, right? And there are not many of those tests out there. One of the ones that gets the closest to it is Enneagram, which, by the way, it got taken over by the marketers, but Oscar Ichazo, the Peruvian priest that invented Enneagram, actually developed it as a tool of spiritual development. And it's when you go to that tool, the way Ichazo designed it, that it's actually the most powerful. And also, personality typing systems don't think of your personality in different contexts.
Yeah.
The way you are and normally is different than the way you are in intimacy. My wife was shocked, for example, how I was behaving when I was around my nanny, that the woman that raised me, other than my mother as my nanny, she's still with us. And when I'm around her, I behave very differently, right? And then how you behave in stress.
Yeah.
Normal intimacy and stress behavior are very different. And in fact, Enneagram, so I'm an Enneagram 5, for example. And in stress and Enneagram, I become an 8. In intimacy, I become, I forget what the number is, but you get my point. So
yeah, it's context.
Personality typing, once you understand that, it can be useful, but it's not useful to select individuals. It's useful to select groups, right? So when you say, well, when you say you're going to create a group with cognitive diversity,
yeah,
you only pick a certain type. So for example, the very prevalent, dominant personality type in investing is the INTJ, right? The introverted, intuitive thinking judger.
Yeah.
So let's explain it for the audience. Introvert or extrovert means, do you get energy from other people or do you get energy from being by yourself? Intuitive or sensor. Intuitive, are you pattern recognizer, conceptual, or are you a sensor? Is that how you get information, or are you a sensor, you get information from the 5 senses? Once the information comes, do you think about it first, or do you feel about it? And then once you have synthesized the information, can you make a fast decision? Are you a J, or do you need more information? Are you a perceiver?
Yeah.
So my personality type, for example, is ENTJ. By the way, the first time you see your personality type on paper, the way that you know that it's actually your personality type is you're uncomfortable when you see it.
It exposes that part. You don't want to look too close. You're like, oh, that sounds, oh,
You're
are you
like,
sure?
exactly, right?
Yeah.
So it's very important, because the first time I saw it, I was like, that doesn't feel good. And not only that, I also wasn't self-aware enough to understand that I wasn't an INTJ, right? Because all the guys that I admired in the investment business were INTJ.
Yeah.
Right? By the way, there are personality typing algorithms. So one of the things that we've done, for example, and it's fun, is taken all the speeches of Buffett, all the speeches of Soros, all the speeches of Druckenmiller, and then we put them into this personality typing algorithm. And we see what comes out. And that way, when we're interviewing somebody, and we can take their writing and put it in there and see who they correspond with. Just as again, it's not perfect, but it's pretty indicative.
I can't believe, I think you mentioned this once to me, and now I'm realizing, wait, I can't believe I haven't taken a closer look at that and written about it. That's an amazing idea.
It's fun. It's fun.
It's also indicative, right, of...
we also can't share that algorithm with you because it's right. But go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, because you said, for example, INTJ is prevalent among investors. I always try to remind myself, there's many ways to skin the cat and make money in markets, and they're very different types.
Totally.
So from value to trade, like even Soros and Buffett and Druckenmiller is probably a good example of people who approach things very differently, and so you can succeed. You just have to figure out, like, the more you know about yourself, the more you can pick a strategy and approach, a philosophy that works with that temperament and your own strengths. Otherwise, you try to emulate. And you talked about, you called it imitate to innovate, right? It's easy to, in the beginning, try to imitate somebody when there is not even, like, to imitate the wrong idea just because, oh, somebody else was successful with that. I'm going to try to
Right.
do that without understanding the context and also, I guess, the personality type, right?
Right.
The degree to which it fits.
But this is where power pairs come in.
Hmm.
And this is a pattern that shows up consistently in the investment business, and no one ever talks about it. And what it is so you're an INTJ. If you're self-aware, you understand your constraints and your limitations.
Hmm.
And the way to transcend those is actually to behave a little bit more outside your personality type, to have that sort of adaptation potential where you're able to do that. So me, for example, I've trained myself on how to be an introvert. It's not my happy place,
Hmm.
but I can more or less do it. And in the case of the introvert, his growth is going to come from when he puts himself in an extroverted place. So, for example, one of the things I always suggest introverts to do is coach a little league team,
Hmm.
coach a younger analyst or team or teach, put yourself out there. And the growth that comes from that is pretty staggering. Having said that, a power pair is actually very useful. So let's say you're an INTJ. What's your power pair? Select guys that are ENTPs. So extroverted, intuitive thinking perceivers, right? You're an introvert, he's an extrovert. So he's going to ask you questions that are going to draw you out. You both speak the same language, which is the two middle words, intuitive thinking. I don't know if you've ever tried to speak to intuitive feelers or sensor feelers, but it's very, very difficult. Words have different meanings. It's a different value system. It's a different way of seeing things. It's very valuable, but this is where a lot of clashes and relationships come, right? But what's even more powerful for the INTJ, because he's a fast decision maker, and that's one of the flaws of the INTJ and ENTJs, the perceiver slows you down.
Hmm.
It says, hey, I know you want to do this, but have you considered X, Y, and Z? And now the INTJ can go and consider even more.
That's interesting.
So for me, an ENTJ, for example, my power pair is INTP.
Hmm.
When I'm working with an INTP, this is how the magic happens. Especially one of my flaws is fast decision making.
Yeah.
I see something, let's do that. And the INTP is like, hey, can you calm down a second? Have you considered X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, no, I had not. But now that I have, let's do this.
Yeah.
And again, you need this power pair. If you think about Buffett, when we put Buffett in the personality typing algorithm, he comes out INTJ. When you put Munger, he comes out ENTJ, but the J is really close to a P.
Hmm.
And think about all the books and the information that we've gotten from Munger versus that we've gotten from Buffett. And one of the reasons why they do so well, I believe, of course I could be wrong, but it's because of that polarity,
Hmm.
that power pair potential. I can name hedge fund after hedge fund or investment firms after investment firms where this power pair concept exists.
Interesting. Yeah, that's powerful, and um, I guess it's interesting because I'm reminded there are some examples where you'll have people in a firm and they kind of discuss that dynamic, like, oh, I'm the person who's like more on the, I don't know, more intuitive, I'm a little faster, and then we have the more conservative like they'll talk about the relationship without actually using these terms, but they'll describe the dynamic of finding a decision. At the same time, I'm reminded that it's kind of rare to find true, I guess, I don't know, co-PM, even with Buffett and Munger, right? It's not, it's kind of equals, but Buffett's calling the shots, and like so it's I wonder how this plays out in real life, because you're often you come out at the point it's like, well, one person has to be in charge, and so I guess that person has to find a good partner to play off of, and that person has to be okay with being, second among equals.
Yes,
Not truly cool.
you can't have two fingers on a trigger.
Yeah, yeah.
You need one guy to finally get to the final decision. But usually it comes within a power pair after having spoken about that decision. In the investment business, you need confidants, to
Mm.
people to bounce ideas off of, especially me, by the way, as an extrovert, because one of the problems with extroverts in the investment business is we need to speak about an idea to shape it out. The problem with that is when we're speaking, the gibberish comes out. We haven't shaped it out yet.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
number of times where I say, well, it's this, and I'm like, wait, no, wait, now that I've heard it, no, no, it's not that.
Mhm.
And it drives the introverts crazy,
Yeah.
right? So you kind of need that. The other thing is the reason why this concept is powerful is we find that most funds that have done well, these power pairs happen by accident. Very few of them went and consciously said, hey, you know what? I'm an ENTJ. Let me hire a bunch of INTPs around,
Right, right.
or I'm an INTJ. We need the extroverts. In fact, I would say that most of the tests in the hedge fund business are designed to crowd out the extroverts and to hire these highly introverted dorks that are people after my own heart. The problem is you're left with a monoculture.
Hmm.
You don't have cognitive diversity inside the business, right?
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit from the networking and touch on a couple of questions that came up in with me and with people I've talked to after the previous talk we've done, and one was and you talked. I still like that phrasing where you said, okay, basically learning is behavioral change. Unless you get to that place of change, you're not actually you haven't actually learned. You've just ingested information. And I also remember you have the saying of where you say tension is the enemy of learning, which you apply
Yes.
in different ways. So I'm curious, say somebody's, listen to your talk, they have all these ideas about learning, but you're trying to implement it. Like, what are some of the blockers? Where does some of this tension come from that may prevent people from actually um, having that information and implementing it in their own life and seeing that behavioral change? I think it's so easy. Somebody like me, I'm like, I'll take notes. I think I got it. And then a year later, I look back and like, wait a second, what? Nothing happened. I didn't do the thing. I just listened and I felt smart, but I didn't use it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think again, I covered this in the presentation, but we think that just cramming our minds with information and
Yeah.
repeating. And by the way, in many ways, it's a fault of the school systems, right? Where they don't teach you how to apply it. They cram your brain with information. My mentor calls it, he doesn't call it the educational system, he calls it the diseducational system. You can get him really going about the school systems, and don't get me started, by the way. And so learning how to practice something and taking words and turning them into works is what really matters, and this is where you get really the value. And the primary blockage, like you mentioned, is tension. And what I would start, by the way, with is imagine you have a teacher and you have some emotional tension with them, especially that is negative.
Mm.
Are you going to listen to him?
Yeah.
Probably not. Contrary, it's like, why should I listen to that guy? Can't stand him,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So tension, a teacher that doesn't establish rapport with his students, emotionally positive, where trust, you've got their back, they know that you're going to teach them things, they respect you, you have authority. That's the enemy. You don't have that. That's the enemy of the learning, right? Well, let's step back again. Your body is a physical, emotional, and mental system all in one. If you have physical tension, you're not going to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
You ever are learn something in a book and you don't really understand it, and a couple of days later you're in the shower and the insight drops? Well, what happens? The hot water in the shower relaxes you, it dissipates tension, and that's how the insights come, right?
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
importance of physical health for learning is massive. Look, the saddest things to happen to me right now is some of my peers that I grew up in the business with have stopped learning.
In what way and why? What do you
They're
think
not
is the reason?
adapting. They no longer want to work on shorts. They no longer want to work on sectors that they don't understand. Oh, this is outside. This is not what I do.
Mm.
Right?
Outside
When
the
we
circle of competence, you mean?
right when we were kids, we didn't know anything. We'd go and lock ourselves in a room and figure it out.
Right.
Now it's like, oh, I can't do that. Very sad for me. When you look at these guys, one of the reasons is their physical health is not what it should be.
Mm.
They no longer have the energy of a younger person. They're tense. They don't eat well. They don't work out. They don't manage stress. You know, one of the main drivers of my life currently is the few hours a day that I spend on exercise and recovery.
Yeah.
And you kind of need to, by the way, in our business because of all the stress. You know, you can have a capacity to handle stress, but there are definitely a lot naturally, but there's definitely a lot of things that you can do to augment that. Massage, uh, acupuncture, you know, and all of the weird shit that you've heard me say over the years that I do, right?
Yes. It's a whole
So,
buffet.
so getting rid of that tension
Mm.
in your body, you can never truly get rid of it, by the way. You can lower it. In many ways, a certain amount of tension is positive, especially to propel you forward. But there are definitely certain things you can do to dissipate it. If you don't, you will break, you will burn out, right? And then the third thing is not having a network for learning. You know, if you have a learning partner, you can push each other forward. Again, too many times guys sit there at their computers, oh, I learned this, but they don't share it with anybody. They don't get feedback.
Yeah.
And you know, be able to have uh, a personal laboratory for learning, which I touched upon,
Yes.
taking from me you learn and applying in a small way, and be willing to have a sort of a risk budget where I'm willing to lose a little bit to learn a lot, and then taking that and applying it somewhere where it's big once you know that it works.
Yeah. I think actually that's a really, I mean, at least for me, I guess both conversation as well as digital conversation, whether it's Twitter or writing something, as soon as you put things out there, you get a chance to have a conversation about it and learn. And you're not always right, but it's much harder to figure that out if you're not putting it out there, and if you're sort of stuck in a. I think the I guess the worst situation would be if you're in a firm, right? You can't share anything, and you're also just working very deeply on a very small number of ideas, right? Sort of the opposite of the futsal concept, which you introduced later, where you sort of yes, you can go deeply, but you don't have a lot of reps, and it's very hard because it takes a long time to figure out whether you're right or wrong. So I think in some ways, some roles today in the investment business are sort of, they're not anti-learning, but it's hard to get that feedback mechanism going if you can't share. And
Mm.
yeah, because I really like the futsal, by the way. That's one of the core ideas that I came away with. Um, and I was
As
actually,
a leader, you know, creating futsal situations for learning is very powerful.
yeah, I was wondering, how do you, because some of this futsal, like the idea, like the person steps into a situation that's very active, right? And just to explain it, right, it's this idea of like a smaller playing field, and you get a lot of reps, a lot of ball contact, in the metaphor, I was thinking like for Buffett, in some ways, it was being on the racetrack and just estimating odds for horse races for a short period. Like he just
Mm.
did that over and over again until he was really skillful at that. But how do you create that, or how do you find it if you don't have it in your life right now?
Having these small businesses that Buffett had, the pinball business,
Right.
you know, delivering papers. Some of the examples that I gave. So some of the PMs that I know, they train people using leaps.
Right. Yeah.
You're only allowed to use leaps or options or puts to express an investment bet. That's it. It constrains them. But when they are allowed to use equities, imagine how they're able to use that different structure to express a bet. Another is giving analysts 4 hours to come up with a decision on an idea. You have 4 hours to figure this out, and limiting that. And then training the analyst to come up with a process ahead of that he can go through in 4 hours that can get him to where he needs to be. So much time is wasted in the analytical community by saying to somebody, hey, tell me by the end of the week if this thing is good or not. Whole week to decide if something is good? No. Limiting that is actually very valuable. So again, it's about, one of the ways that I suggest is creating a Google ad campaign. You're trying to advertise for a service that you use a lot. Design an ad for it and see which people click on what ad, which is more powerful. You have to be very creative at creating these training processes. And we did a case study on the NFL, and one of the main lessons was the 2-minute drill, where you have 2 minutes to the end of the game, quarterback gets the ball. There's so many of these games that depend on these last 2 minutes,
Mm.
and what are the strategies and tactics, conditions and structures that go through between the coaches, the offensive coach, the defensive coach, the quarterback, his offensive weapons, and then the defensive coach of the opposite team and defensive weapons, right? Fascinating, the lessons that come from that.
So it's like you're
So
finding the game within the game, right? Like
yeah,
just a shorter.
it's a shorter time period, it's
Yeah.
constrained, but think about how much more emotional, how much more tense, how much more pressure is in that, and how much more you can learn from it,
Yeah.
right? The other thing is, I don't know if I mentioned this in the presentation, I forget, but when you're learning, you want to learn from fields that have battle tested methods, right?
Okay.
Intelligence, the things that they've tried, when it did not work, people died.
Right.
So the things that they keep doing usually tend to work.
Mm.
Same thing in the military, same thing in sports, same thing in construction, for example, or architecture,
Mm.
right? Their principles, their methods, their tools, they've been battle tested.
It's like
So
like if you talk about the margin of safety, right? You're like, well, the margin of safety in engineering for a bridge, right? Like certain
right,
concepts just hold. They're actually important.
right. I love that Buffett example of, have you seen these Roman bridges that were built
Right.
2,000 years ago? You know why
Yeah.
they're like that? Because the architect has to sleep there with his family afterwards.
Yeah. You get it wrong, it really hurts.
It's
Uh,
your ass, right?
which
So
is that's really interesting though, because it's not always true in the investment business, right? I think one of the issue with learning there is history, um, and there are examples, but so much depends on the context. So much depends on very specific circumstances. And but I think you did some. I mean, if it's okay to say that, I think you did some work, for example, in the '70s, right? And sort of trying to figure out like, okay, what can we learn from certain time periods um, that may have some of the similar conditions that we're experiencing now, and you still have to be kind of careful with that because so many things are also different. But I'm curious how you went about that process and how you apply that, what you found.
so I was having um, breakfast with a friend of mine who runs the investment arm of a very large Italian conglomerate. Brilliant guy, Matteo Scolari. He's become a friend and a confidant recently. Very fortunate to know him. And he asked me, "What does this period remind you of?" And I said, "You know, it reminded me of the early 2000s." And he said, "It reminds me of the 70s." And considering who he knows and also the way he thinks, that really influenced me. And I said, "You know what? I need to go study the 70s because I was born in 1974. What the hell happened in the 70s?" And one of my closest friends, Jason McDougall, who's an investment nerd like I am, him and I, because we have no life, got together in his office and we compiled all of the information that we could get our hands on the 70s. Mutual fund letters from back then, even some of the hedge fund letters and articles that were written on hedge funds, political events, economic events, geopolitical events. And we replayed the 70s from 1968 to 1982. And then we kept noticing some of the patterns that kept occurring. And it took us close to 12 hours to do the whole thing. And then we wrote up the lessons. But more importantly, when you study the past, the problem is, and you're trying to get lessons to apply to the present or the future, the conditions and structures in which the past existed often don't exist today.
Right.
So that's where you fall into the rhyming, repeating problem. You know, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Yeah.
Or as a friend of mine says, it echoes, right?
Mm.
So that when you isolate those differences, it's actually in those differences that the real insights of what's about to happen is actually valuable.
Give me a couple of examples. Like what did
Sure.
you run
So,
into?
so back in the 70s, China GDP as a percentage of global GDP was less than 5%. Today it's close to 20%. Back then, globalization wasn't a thing.
Right.
Today it's massive and ubiquitous. Back then, software did not exist really. Today it does. Back then, automation did not exist. Today it does, right? And in those differences are what you need to analyze to kind of understand, hey, what's about to happen, especially if we deglobalize? What would happen if we took the global supply chain and restructured it to make it more local? And what would happen to the balance sheet that sits on top of that supply chain? Wow, right? But also the other reason why you want to take that into account is our current Fed chair. He thinks a lot about the 70s analog.
Mm.
It's pretty clear that he does not want to be Arthur Burns. He would rather be Volcker.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? But again, as a key difference, global debt to GDP in the 70s was 1x.
Yeah.
Today it's 5x. So you can imagine what's going to happen when there's an increase in cost of capital.
Yes.
It's
not pretty.
Not pretty, you know, and there seems to be a little bit of an ignorance of these historical analogs. And they're worthwhile. But again, you got to be extremely careful to take the past and project it into the present or the future because, you know, conditions have changed.
Yes.
That's how you do these historical analogs.
That's fascinating. I wonder. I talked about this with Dan McMurtry. It's very rare, right, to find investors who succeed decade after decade. Right? Longevity is rare and very valuable, and part of it comes back to the burnout when we talked about, right, the tension and the recovery, like staying healthy. But also you have to remain a learner and you have to figure out how to adapt. And you mentioned how that's difficult, and especially as you get, I guess, older and knowledge that you have already accumulated stands in the way. How do you think about that, right? People who navigated regime change and long periods of just, I don't know, there's a decade in the world just works very differently, and what works in investing and markets is differently. Presumably, those people must have, I guess, just been like, how do you think about the people who were able to navigate that? Were they just better at learning and discarding old models? Did they just get lucky again? What are the lessons from people who, yeah.
Hey, go back to they love the business and they don't want to go and do anything else. So they're like, okay, I got to learn this because
Mm,
otherwise, I don't want to be bad at something that I learned that I'm doing, right? So again, it's really important to love our business. The second thing is you got to be good at unlearning
mm,
what you knew before, but you also need some sort of this amnesia about it. The I find that, and also an amnesia about your mistakes. There's a sort of revisionist history that happens with great investors sometimes, where some past example of them incinerating and eviscerating capital they kind of forgot about.
right.
You need a little bit of that. But also, if you're not going to have that, you have to have this philosophy of mistakes that, hey, it's what we do. Human, we're fallible, and we don't understand things perfectly. And guess what? This is what we do. It's okay. On the contrary, we need these mistakes to learn from and to move on. Right? The other thing is to be able to adapt. It's not only you that has to adapt, but it's your business, it's also your environment.
Yeah.
So when you find these highly frugal investors like Buffett, that frugality actually allows them to adapt better. If you've got a lot of ownership, right? You're not frugal, you have too many people. When change comes, it's much harder for you to change and adapt than it is if you're asset light, right? So one of the personal characteristics that you need is the frugality. We these guys are so frugal that people make fun of them, right? There's that amazing example that the big guy is with Catherine Graham, and Catherine needs a dime to make a phone call,
Oh yeah.
and Buffett's got a quarter, and he's going to make change. And Graham is like, "Give me the quarter, Warren."
Yes.
That's how frugal this guy is, right? It's very important.
Yeah.
I was recently at the house of a very powerful investor, and one of my friends that was there was like, "I can't believe this is how he lives."
Mm,
Because of how much money this guy has versus how he lives, and he's older and grew up in the Depression. Has totally different values
right.
than we do today. Because again, going back, by the way, after 40 years, imagine what Buffett and Munger have seen, and from the time they're born to the time the 70s got there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They saw these cycles. You've seen this. I was in a room the other day and we were talking about the early 2000 analog, and this really young wise ass that I want to strangle sometimes says, "Hey, the only guy that's actually saw the 2000 was this guy," and he pointed to me and the old guy. And this particular analyst, I realized what it was like to deal with me when I was younger,
Yeah.
and what I did to my mentors when they wanted to strangle me, because the way I feel about him is like, I want to go and and I love him, but after dealing with him, I call my mentors and I'm like, dude, whatever I did to you when I was younger, I'm so sorry.
That's
But
great. Yeah.
and he's right. You need to have seen these cycles and have seen that, hey, things change. The another saying is, a lot of young guys are now learning that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 20.
Mm, yeah.
And that math of what happens when a key condition like cost of capital changes, and what it does to valuations, what it does to financing arrangements, what it does to supply chains. what it does to consumer behavior. Take a consumer that has $1 million mortgage and he was paying 30 grand a year. Now it's 7%. He's paying 70 grand a year. Is that going to have an impact?
Yeah.
So the adaptation that you need to see these regimes. First, by the way, and this is an area of study for us. There's 2 areas of study for us that we have. Well, 3. Writers, producers, and directors of movies. The second is culture, how a business culture can actually have an impact on the business, the stock price, and even competition. Just super powerful, especially today, because we have a lot of tech businesses that still have growth cultures that have to become profitability cultures. And guess what? It's really difficult for a CEO to do. Think about the things you have to change as a CEO. You have to change the incentive structure of your sales team. You have to fire unprofitable customers. Your board of directors, the KPIs that they track so that you can have a strategic conversation with them, they change. Your supplier relationships change. So if you went from a growth culture, that a growth environment that we went through, and now we have to focus on profitability culture, it's really difficult. And then the third avenue of research is these regime shifts, which we continually are able to defend from them in my fund, but we haven't yet been able to go on offense on them. And one of the really annoying parts is I'll share that it's a regime change with some friends of mine, and they're able better to go on offense on it than I am, which is really annoying, but we're working on it and we're getting better at it, actually. So little by little.
They love having you in the triad in the network. They're like, oh,
Oh,
yeah.
you bet they do. Including a friend of mine, who's having way better performance than I am, and he just took what I told him and went on offense on it. Whereas we defended from it. But I'm learning, and I think we isolated a few issues, but that's for a different time.
Yeah. Do you want to just quickly touch on why you would study writers, producers, people in, I guess, creative and media as an investor? What is the
You
idea?
bet. So one is to study creativity, but 2, I believe that there's a very strong correlation between good writing and good investing, and great writing and great investing. And the writing process very much resembles the investment process. And a lot of writing concepts, for example, one recent one for me is subtext, where I was watching an interview by Tarantino, and he was talking about doing the subtext of a scene.
Okay.
Where he says, okay, you've taken a piece of writing and you're about to film the scene, but the way that you truly get to the value of the emotion of the scene is by asking, hey, this character, what does he want out of this interaction? And the character he's speaking with, what does he want out of this interaction? And then you as a director, what do I want out of this interaction? And then looking from the point of view of the audience and saying, what is the audience going to get out of this interaction? And by doing that, you're more able to get to the insight of what this film is really going, or the scene is really going to be about. So not only doing the contextual work, but to doing the subtextual work, right? Well, in the investment business, that's a very powerful thing to do. How does a customer see this company? How does a supplier see this company? How does a competitor see this company? How does the investment business see this company? And in those mix of perspectives, that's how insights drops.
Interesting.
Right.
So it's about, I guess, different perspectives, or like it's a way to interpret in one case it's a scene, in this case it's any kind of security or like an asset or a specific situation where you're trying to figure out where's everybody's headed.
Yes. That's just one thing you learn. The other is, especially amazing directors, I have this, Chris Nolan obsession, for example. I think Chris
Mm,
is incredible. Um, the way that he's able to, by the way, Nolan, prototypical INTJ, the way that he's able to harness resources and direct them, it's a masterclass in leadership, in my opinion. And also how he's able to fight back the institutional imperatives that exist in the investment business.
yeah,
Because the studios, they want something that's going to make money, whereas the creator wants something that's going to stand on its own.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that tension, is you need to know how to manage it and create something that really matters. So that's just one aspect that you're learning from that. And there's some great books. Some of the books on, and not only great books, but some great YouTube. Uh,
Mm,
because I'm very visual.
mm,
Not only do I want to read something, but I'll say, hey, what was that actual interview?
yeah,
Tarantino said this, and you watch the interview. One of the reasons why we love this NFL study that we did, for example, were the insights, which is insane, was when you were reading something that, I don't know, Belichick was doing, you could actually go to the YouTube and get the visual
yes,
clips and compare and contrast what the writer is talking about, what you were seeing, and then what the big guy was seeing too, right?
yeah.
So it's very valuable for learning and for pattern recognition, and also from taking lessons from other fields and applying it to investing.
I appreciate that. I always, and I'm gonna see if I can find a few links to put into the piece on this. But
Well,
yeah,
go to outstanding screenplays,
okay.
or I'll send you a link
Hmm.
of these YouTube channels where it's you look, especially for writing, because you have to know how to write, not only to create content and to leverage the intellectual component of your work. That way you share that and it accomplishes goals for you. But for the investment business, the number of time where somebody will show you a memo,
Yeah,
that memo in 3 pages is the reason why you're about to make 10 times your money.
yeah,
It's a very important way to to do research, and you have to read this stuff.
that's
Um,
true. I love how this is something I appreciate about you, and also, I guess, just in general, the ability to draw, to connect different domains and draw on these lessons from way outside the world of investing and bring it back in a very practical sense, right? Like, what do I study? Okay, I incorporate this into the writing, the research process, but also metaphorically, oh, the tension between the business and the craft is the same in
right.
filmmaking as it is in investing and in other domains. I always
Right.
love that.
And by the way, that's my mentors. I learned that directly from Michael Mauboussin, who believed in this concept of consilience.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So again, I learned that from him, but I've really taken it to heart. And also I enjoy it. But look, to tie it all together, when we did the NFL study, we actually took some of the insights, designed questions around them, and then started calling people in the NFL,
Mm, okay.
from coaches to team owners to players, even. Some of the fun conversations were with the agents. That was really interesting. And these guys couldn't believe it. It's like, these guys
Yeah.
calling. It's like, yeah, well, we want to learn. And the insights we got were massive. And the people we met are really cool.
It's a different kind of field work from going into a mall.
That's
So
right. That's right. And some of my favorite strategic relationships now have actually come from that study. So we're going to do the same thing. I was with a friend um, on Zoom last weekend, and we were talking about it. And he said, "Hey, you're working on this. I know this one screenwriter, and the screenwriter happens to be one of my favorite screenwriters. So that's also how you jack up serendipity. Josh Wolf has this great saying of harnessing randomness and optionality.
Yes.
And sharing your work is how you do that. Reid Hoffman, he has a great saying: share your work early, share it often.
Mm.
Right? That's how you get stuff to come back to you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, all the way back to network building. I appreciate it. Listen, I appreciate that you took the time. I thought this was, I have tons of notes. I think there's so much good stuff in here. So I'm really excited actually to share it. As you said, share early, share often. I've got a lot to learn and implement in terms of behavioral change myself.
we
I feel
all
like
do,
this
Bob.
was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
We all do. And thank you. Thank you.